So, after my recent video about Wind and Truth and Stormlight in general went out and got way more engagement than I think I've ever had on any video, and just started a lot of really great conversations. One thing that was specifically brought up several times was my brief comments in there about diversity and inclusion, and some people just not following what I was talking about or thinking that I was talking about something different, or one comment specifically just saying that when you talk about that, you need to be specific, which I agree with. I think I was probably vague, and honestly, I think it opens up a lot of things that are interesting to discuss and talk about trends within fantasy. So let's talk about it. Hello and welcome to my channel. So in this video, we're going to be continuing my talking about things that are sometimes iffy to talk about on BookTube, but I really wanted to do this and start a conversation about diversity and inclusion in fantasy, kind of a little bit of what it's been in the past, where we are now, and just explain my thoughts on it. Now, I will start too, and I'm going to address some things, some comments that were made on the video I did about Stormlight, because that's sort of what started this conversation. But I really do want this to be something that starts a conversation, so absolutely let me know your thoughts. Whether you agree or disagree with me at all is completely fine. I was very pleasantly surprised that whether people agreed or disagreed, the comment section on that Stormlight video was actually, for the most part, very constructive. I didn't see a lot of people like with anger or fighting and that kind of thing. So that was nice to see. So let's try and keep it that way. So. First, let's talk a little bit about it with diversity and inclusion. And so I'm talking about this in general, and specifically with Stormlight, this included the mental health thing, which I feel like most people are pretty aware of, and Wind and Truth did also. Specifically, I know I DNF'd before getting to any of the parts to read them myself, but did include a more prominent gay relationship, as well as some discussion on being female male, so kind of dialogue on trans kind of issues and that type of thing as well. I specifically mentioned in that video that I felt like a lot of the bits of diversity inclusion felt very, very forced in this. So one thing I want to note there is what I meant by forced, because some people pointed out, and I think this is totally fair and not something I thought about when I used that word, but that it makes it sound like I'm super against it and I think he's just shoving it in and should not have included any of these types of things, which is not at all what I was trying to say. Really, I'm talking about the execution of it. So, as several people pointed out on that video too, the mental health thing has always been there, and there have even been some mentions, like Rhythm of War kind of teased the whole Renarin and Relaine thing. Also, don't yell at me for my pronunciation of Stormlight characters. I've never done audio, and I know I say them wrong, but it's the way my brain works. But that was kind of teasing a little bit. There's other kind of mentions of it. And so it's not like that any of that stuff is brand new, but there's a really big difference. And I know a lot of people talked about it in Rhythm of War, where it felt like the focus on mental health was becoming so much of a thing where it was just really throwing it at you and just really going a little bit over the top. And it started to make it feel like, for me, the characters were more just like walking mental health diagnoses versus characters that also had to deal with that. And that's where it started to feel really clumsy. From the bits I read of Wind and Truth, and from having a lot of discussions, because I don't know if I'm going to pick it back up, so I've talked some spoilers with people as well. It seems like it's really gone that way more so, with both just being really, really there, the kind of the introspection, the dialogues that just to me felt a lot clumsier than what we had, and that with that being the focus, seemed like it really was just getting there. And so that's what I mean by I'm saying forced. It feels like we're trying to talk about this as much as possible, shove it in where it doesn't necessarily feel like it fits. Very specifically, actually, for me, the kind of the inclusion thing that felt just super out of place is really early on. There's a description of somebody who is basically being described as like an emo alt girl kind of thing. It talks about how she likes to use her light weaving to paint her nails black and do edgy tattoos. And I'm just, how on earth does that fit into Roshar and Stormlight? Because it just felt like, I'm like, why are we just putting that random thing in there? So nothing to do at all with mental health or with sexuality, just kind of an odd inclusion there. And it felt like there was a lot of that with the real world terminology, kind of things like that too. That was the biggest thing that felt forced to me, is we're constantly having in there, and I've heard lots of examples, just terms, phrases, wording, the dialogue, it all felt like it didn't fit, and it didn't really feel like it was a Stormlight book anymore. It again felt like we were just really changing things, and all of this stuff felt super out of place to me, and it felt like it was forced in. Not saying that it shouldn't have been included, and that's kind of something that I want to extrapolate on my thoughts of some good examples, some bad examples, and the way I think about it. And I want to note too that yes, I'm a straight white guy. I totally get that the inclusion bits aren't going to be as meaningful for me as they're going to be for people who are like seeing themselves in there. I can find all kinds of fantasy to do that with, so I'm well aware that people are going to have different opinions, and that's completely okay. But that's just kind of what I meant when I said it felt forced. Not that the inclusion of it at all, but just the execution felt very clunky. It just felt like he was trying to put it in there just for the sake of it being in there and not really doing a great job handling it. And I'll talk more, but for me, I feel like having any of those elements, whether we're talking about mental health, whether we're talking about race, sexuality, gender, all of that, I feel like having that be more organically part of the story is a much smoother reading experience, but also I feel like is what we should want, because the whole idea is that it's 2024, it's almost 2025. That stuff should be normal. It's a normal part of our everyday lives. Why is it that we're still having the issue where sometimes we have to feel like throw it in your face, like, look at this is this character, this is what they are, this is who they are, and it feels really off-putting to read anything like that, no matter what it is. And that could be sometimes you get that with edgy characters, is I think another really great example of what I'm talking about in a completely different way, where the whole identity of the characters, I'm too edgy, I'm just edgy, this that. And it also is just like, it's not a very good reading experience when you try to shove something and make that just the big focus. And I feel like that's happened with a lot of the characters, whether it's their mental health, whether it's the sexuality in general, because Wind of Truth also brought sexuality up to the fore quite a lot, way more than it did. And some people commented, there's the love triangle, there were these things, but there's more like overt, open sexuality, sexual content, things talked about that just were really not. And so it also, when you bring a lot of these elements in that weren't really there or weren't super prominent or were just done as kind of a normal thing, but all of a sudden we're really jumping in, that's where I feel like it felt a little bit forced and clunky for me. So that's kind of what I was getting at there. Now, I think ultimately, and I responded to several comments about this too, I think Sanderson's coming from a good place. I don't think this is just Sanderson trying to chase what the masses want. I do think it plays into that because Sanderson is huge and he's mainstream, as I talked about, and the masses do want more of that kind of thing. They want more representation, they want more of that kind of thing, and he's gotten that feedback, and so I think he's coming from a good place. He's really wanting to do that and include these things because he's heard all the things where people really identify with it, but I think he needs to be reined in because I don't think he's doing a good job executing it, and it just makes it feel, again, forced. So that's what I mean by that term. And if people didn't take it like that, like I said, I think several people did not. And people were generally like, hey, can you elaborate what you mean? So again, I was very, very pleasantly surprised with the discourse. Nobody just like attacking me or anything with it. And so hopefully we'll continue there. So let's talk a little bit more outside of Wind and Truth, because I think this is, like I said, a very interesting conversation. And I'm going to talk about what I like to see this. And keep in mind, this is my opinion. This is my thoughts. I'm talking about books and I'm talking about my taste and how I approach reviewing and my commentary on this. So it's all going to be subjective, of course. There's no right answer. There's no objective best way to do it. But I'm going to talk about this to give you kind of my insight, and I would love to hear yours as well with what you like to see. If what I'm saying makes sense, or if you disagree, let me know. I would love to have that conversation as well. So for me, as I kind of teed up a little bit, I like to see all of these different elements just as a normal part of the world. And for me, I think with it, less is definitely more. Now, I know that might also, some of these things I feel like it's just the things, the way I'm describing it, which is how it makes sense in my brain, might have a negative connotation. So that's not what I'm trying to say. I'm not saying we should put less of this in, but with it, I think like with the description, less is more. Now, a really good example of this outside of books is I've noticed this in a lot of TV shows. TV shows that will just have a character who's gay, and like maybe it's brought up like, oh, I'm gay, and it's just like, it's there. It's just a part of them. It's not like this is their whole identity or this is what we're going to focus on. It's just mentioned. And I think that's a really great way of doing it, where you're just like, hey, this is the thing. One example I'll specifically bring up is Brooklyn Nine-Nine is an example of a show that has a prominent character that's gay. There's a lot more to that, to their personality, and it's something that's just kind of nonchalantly mentioned. It's normal, and it's not like it's this huge thing, it's this huge secret. It's not like we're constantly having to talk about it. It's just normal, and that's what I prefer to see. I think that's more realistic, for one, because again, all of these different things we're talking about are pretty normal as part of our everyday lives, and so when you try to make it more of a spectacle, it feels disingenuous to me personally, and maybe others, like I said, feel differently, but that's kind of what I think works for me. And I want to talk to a little bit about a couple of examples of other things in books specifically, because I want to talk about in fantasy, and talk about a little bit as well the kind of the history of this, and go from there. So let's start and talk, because I think the conversation about diversity, inclusion, all of these kinds of things as well, is a big one, especially in fantasy, because fantasy is something that the kind of, the Euro-Western centric kind of all-white cast, pretty normal thing. And, in fantasy, sci-fi as well too, but in fantasy, there's been a lot of it where either it was you just had absolutely no diversity in characters a lot, or if you do have the token character of whatever they happen to be, it'd be like offensive stereotypes, or they'd be a caricature, or that's kind of their own thing. And so I think typically everybody agrees that that's not really great. That's not what you want. And so I think in some ways you get the opposite, where these days, where there are some books where it just feels like we're coming from a good place, of trying to put more different types of people so that people can have that representation, but doing it in a way that it just feels like it's thrown in just because, oh, this is what people want, and not having it be a natural part of the story. And that's something that I also think it makes it for not a very good reading experience, but also, again, just feels a little bit disingenuous. If you're doing it as like a marketing thing, like, oh, this is what people want, I just don't feel like that feels very genuine. And it for me, it usually shows in the books. And you had it too, where sometimes it's people will include more and more stuff, but do it in either a negative way or just in a stereotypical way. So I think getting to where it's just kind of a normal way, that for me is the ideal, and something that I think works and also makes the reading experience good. So let's talk about some examples here, because I think that's something that makes sense. Now, specifically for Sanderson, I think he dealt with a lot of mental health type of issues without specifically calling them out and putting them in fore, even in Stormlight, in an earlier Stormlight, where it was a part of the characters in there. I will note specifically, as far as like gender identity, the whole like not being male or female discussion, he included that in his YA sci-fi series, the Skyward books, in a way that I actually think was much better than a lot of the stuff in Stormlight, because it was just kind of a comment. And I think it works somewhat in sci-fi because you have aliens that literally aren't. But so, like, just an example there with Sanderson. But specifically, if we are talking about a few things. Now, I don't have the book anymore, but one thing that comes to mind, because I remember calling it out in my review, it was like the Dark Star Dragon, or the like Doom of the Dark Star Dragon, something like that. I should have looked up this specific book. But in this particular book, there's kind of a multiverse, different worlds sort of thing, and there are these big group of people. They just happen to be a diverse group of people. It's not really addressed or specifically talked about, but they just happen to be really diverse in the way that they're described. And there's a character from another world, and they just make a comment about they're kind of surprised by that because on their world, people will go to war with other races and that type of thing. And somebody just responds, he's like, why would that even matter? Why would that make a difference? Like, our enemy are the, people like these, like pirates. Like, pirates are the enemy. Why would we care about what race somebody is? And I'm just like, yes, there we go. Just it's throwing it in there, being like, hey, do you see how kind of dumb it is that racism is a thing? And it's a great way of doing it, and just having it be a natural part of the world. And I think that was handled really well there. If we're talking about specifically with like sexuality, LGBT, The Burning Kingdoms, which I highly recommend this series in general, I think is a really good example of doing this right, because our two main characters are both they're in a same-sex relationship to an extent, and there are lots of other characters that are gay, or have complicated feelings about that type of thing, and it's something that is specifically there. It's not the whole identity of the characters. There's a lot more to them than just their sexuality, but it's there. These books are also not a romance, because people always try to say that it's a romance. It's not. There are romantic elements in there, but it's not. And it's just a part of who these characters are. There's never this big description, and without giving any spoilers, because one of the particular events does happen later, but there's a specific character who seems to be kind of struggling with their thoughts on that, because in the country that they're from, that's not okay. But there's the other country that a lot of this takes place, and just says, hey, it's okay. It's, in our culture, we don't really care about that kind of thing. It's totally fine and normal. You don't have to feel ashamed. And it's a way of pointing out that, like, hey, this should be normal, without just turning it into the only thing that is the focus. And so I think it's a really great example of something done really, really well when we're talking about those types of topics here. And that worked really, really well. Now, I know this is a popular series as well. I really didn't care for it for a lot more than this, but the negative example comes from the Chorus of Dragons by Jen Lyons. The first book in that one is the, oh my gosh, I am drawing a blank on the name now, but I'm completely forgetting what the name of it is now. Anyway, Chorus of Dragons, Jen Lyons, that series. So the first book was kind of different. And the first book, I think, actually did a decent job with just having it be present but not there. The second book kind of infamously, though, and I think, again, coming from a good place, but infamously in the second book, there is a scene where these characters are sitting down and one character basically stops and starts explaining the idea of being transgender in depth to another character based on their culture. And I know a lot of people had issues with that. I'm sure there were people who had issues with it because they're like, transgender. Me, I had issues with it because it felt like, again, we're turning this into a spectacle, acting like this is just this crazy thing that people aren't going to understand, when I think people pretty well understand it these days. And I'm sure there are some other people who still, need that. But we spent so long talking about it, going into details about it, and then it's also pretty much ignored. It's because I thought it was such an interesting idea, actually, where it's this culture where that's really normal. Like, there is a thing that exists where if you how you identify, they use stallions and mares, which is kind of supposed to be, masculine and feminine, but it has nothing to do with your gender there. You just kind of choose that, and you can actually, like, there's something that exists where you can go and change gender if that's that. And it's just kind of, it's put as like a normal part of the culture and like a really deep part of the culture. And then it's completely ignored because we still have the character who does not at all abide by that from that culture. And so it's, again, like, you spend all this time setting it up, trying to make it seem like it's this part of the culture, spending probably too much time explaining it, but then you also kind of throw it out the window. And for me, that was a really bad example of how to include those sorts of elements in a way and have them feel natural, because it was going the other extreme. It's specifically calling this out, turning this into a really big focus, and then also not following through with having it be normalized. So that was an example of one that I think did a particularly bad job with those types of elements. And so that's again, something for me. Now, you may agree, disagree with either of those examples, but that's kind of the way that I look at it here with it. And that's kind of where I'm coming from. And I think it's really great. And ultimately, if you're having, unless it's specifically in a negative way, like I mentioned, which there are plenty of books that did that in the past, especially, and you still see some today, I'm sure. But unless you're doing it specifically in a negative way, I feel like inclusion in general, whether, again, we're talking about race, we're talking about sexuality, we're talking about mental health, we're talking about anything, having all kinds of different diverse types of people, types of things in general, I think is a great thing in fantasy. And especially it's fantasy when, the rules don't apply to a lot of things. You can do whatever you want, so why would you not have extra stuff? Why would you, like, lock yourself down? So I think it's really great that we have it. And I think typically when we're including different types of people that maybe are underrepresented in fantasy, no matter what attribute you're looking at, I think it's typically going to be a net positive. But I'm also, I review books on the internet, and I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to critique when I think it's done poorly, because I think that just kind of dampens the reading experience for me. And like I said, I mentioned a couple of times where that is the case. Now, I feel like there's lots of them where it's sort of middling, and sometimes I feel like it's people who are trying, but they just aren't very good at executing it. And that's where I feel like Sanderson fell in as well. I really do think he's trying, but also you do sometimes get where it just seems like people are like, oh, this is the hot thing to do these days, let's try and just shove this in. And it's when it's not actually a part of the story organically, to me, it just doesn't come across in the same way. So those are kind of my thoughts. Like I said, I really, with this, I want this to be a conversation to start. I really loved all of the comments, whether people disagreed or agreed with me on that other video. And so I think there's a lot to discuss. And again, like I said, kind of at the beginning here, I know that people who are really wanting to see themselves represented in books and have not had that in the past, I know that this is going to be a lot more meaningful and special to you if you're finding yourself, you're for whatever reason are underrepresented in fantasy and you're seeing yourself there. I totally get that that's going to be a lot more meaningful to you, and that I might not totally get it. And I'm not saying that I do, but I'm just kind of explaining where I come from with this and what my thoughts are of it when I'm trying to look and review books, critique books, talk about what I think is done well and not. And so, yeah, I would love to, like I said, love to hear your thoughts and everything about this. So let me know in the comments. That's really it for this one, though. So again, let me know in the comments. I'd love to start a conversation and talk about it. But otherwise, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a like. Check the links in the description, as always, for the Patreon if you want to support what I do, as well as the Wizardly Enclave Discord if you want to chat books, whether any of the books I mentioned, or really anything at all. It's a lot of fun, and we'd love to have you. And of course, if you enjoy my content, make sure to subscribe.